Welcome to the Beyond the Lectern Podcast. This is episode 1. I'm Jason Lodge.
And I'm Rachel Searston, and we're going to be having conversations with experts in the field of higher education, which is a really diverse and interdisciplinary field. And we're going to be talking to these experts about different aspects of teaching and learning, things like curriculum design and feedback and learning analytics.
For episode 1, we were fortunate enough to have Professor Dragan Gašević from the University of Edinburgh, who spoke to us a little bit about learning analytics. So Dragan is Professor and Chair in Learning Analytics and Informatics in the Schools of Education and Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. He's well known globally for his work in learning analytics and is the immediate past president of the Society of Learning Analytics Research.
We're going to be talking about the future of learning analytics, and so I give you our conversation with Dragan Gašević.
Welcome, Dragan. So thank you for joining us on the podcast today. So one of the things that we thought would be good to talk about at the beginning is that obviously you work in this area of learning analytics. So can you give us a bit of a sense of what it's been like to be part of a really emerging kind of field of research? Because I guess that's not something that everybody really gets to experience, you know. So a lot of the things that we deal with in education have been around for a long time. So it's sort of exciting to see something emerge that's new and different. So can you give us a sense from your perspective about what that's been like?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jason, for having me, and Rachel as well. Pleasure to talk to you about learning analytics. It's probably been one of the best experiences in the professional level for me in terms of this new field of learning analytics. I've been from early days involved into the formation of the field. So in 2010, we pretty much started to create a new conference. 2011 was the first edition in Canada. I typically say on minus 35 Celsius in Banff. So we had a great attendance. Nobody wanted to go out. But on a kind of a personal level, in terms of basically having different groups of people to interact with. And it seems that learning analytics is not the thing for a particular group of researchers. Typically, people would try to pretend to develop like an interdisciplinary field. But with learning analytics, what happens is pretty much everybody comes in and say, oh, but I'm so different. And then they realize everybody else is so different. Like we have a number of educationalists, psychologists, biologists, people from economy, people from business, people from computer science. We also have numerous senior leaders and so on. So for me, one of the critical things with respect to learning analytics was that while in the past I did a lot of research and my background is in computer science, that kind of impact that I had in the past was not really as nearly as significant as it is now. All of a sudden we started kind of relevant to be part of conversations with senior leaders in higher education, with also different policymakers outside of necessarily higher education institutions, but different ministries. All of a sudden, when my research became relevant for IT organizations, although in the past I was doing hardcore IT. So that basically has been quite rewarding. On the other hand, it's been also quite challenging in a way to try to balance different perspectives, in a way to make sure that we are quite open, rather than basically follow the traditional model of a single genius sitting in the room and I'm claiming my space for me. Rather, we tried and made sure that we were driven not by personalities but by policies. And that basically created a field that was quite open and people come in easily, they join and they basically say, oh, this is my new home. I want to be part of it. Part of that was also open process in terms of leading things and so on.
So there are multiple stakeholders, but also multiple people who are researching how we might use data and analytics to improve educational practices. And that's one of the things I picked up on reading one of your papers is the interdisciplinary nature of the field. So do you have any insights about some of the challenges that come with that and maybe even some of the benefits of that interdisciplinary nature?
No, that's a quite a great question, actually. There are numerous benefits. In a way, what is the biggest thing that was somehow naturally decided upon, and that basically is through the field being evolving as well, is that it's not a single discipline which is the carrier of the field, but rather we tend to call it a bricolage field. Composition of a technical layer where we build on statistics, machine learning, data mining and social network analysis. On the kind of more interpretational level, we try to work with people from psychology, from sociology, from even philosophy and other relevant areas. And then also we are trying to involve other relevant stakeholders. Obviously, it's a long way in terms of the challenges. Everybody comes to the conference or to the field with their own kind of perspective, and then they realize, oh my goodness, this is not quite what I actually imagined. So for example, early days, everybody wanted to crunch data. Everybody wanted to just apply magic of machine learning algorithms as if that magic will give us all the answers. Yet we, after a while, realize, well, maybe they're giving us all the answers, yet we don't know what the questions were to start from. And so that's basically one of the critical things. One of the critical approaches to address these challenges is really to open that dialogue, to have opportunities for people to express that dialogue and to build a shared understanding of the kind of common issues that are being addressed, and then to try to establish teams that are also typically multidisciplinary. We found that teams are usually quite homogeneous. They may do some work, but these teams are not necessarily the most productive ones, and they don't typically lean into the most effective types of approaches that are used in practice as well.
So one of the things I think that is interesting, and I always think of the analogy between what's happening in learning analytics and what's happening in other interdisciplinary areas like educational neuroscience is one that I tend to always go back to. One of the things I think has been really interesting there is that there can tend to be some sort of roadblocks in terms of the way that people communicate with each other within these interdisciplinary endeavours, because some of the assumptions about the basic processes or the basic ways of thinking in different disciplines kind of tend to miss each other to an extent. Is this something that you think is happening in learning analytics?
To a certain extent, it did perhaps initially happen, and I think to a certain extent some of these things are happening as well at the moment. The thing is, I don't know, maybe the field of learning analytics has been slightly also fortunate to have also field of educational data mining alongside, and the field of educational data mining is much more focused on the fundamental computational methods, development of different type of machine learning technologies and so on. With learning analytics, initially perhaps there were some attempts as well to go in that direction. However, I think with some of the early works, we tried to make sure inside of the field that that's not the only voice, but rather it's pretty much interdisciplinary. So for some people, they initially come in from their disciplinary expectations, like computer science comes in and say, well, this is really quite superficial for us computer science because you're not really developing a novel method. At the same time, you really need to be even quite far away from that problem if you always want to have that kind of new method to be developed. But rather, you need to understand that particular problem that you are trying to address, and that basically over time builds in understanding that theory is really what drives learning analytics rather. And when I say theory with both capital T and lowercase t, right? Our small theories that are coming from practice, and also theory that comes from research and science. And that's really something that we are trying to make sure. Of course, if you look into the literature, there are still plenty of the existing work that come, for example, from design. Prepare a beautiful dashboard, yet doesn't really address any relevant questions that are of interest for practice of learning and teaching.
Yeah, so you hinted before that the field really started out as fairly atheoretical, but now people are considering the theoretical frameworks that you might be able to talk about through the lens of learning analytics. So do you foresee any theoretical frameworks or any approaches that are emerging in the field? So for example, I'm thinking about there's a lot of research on the use of errors to promote learning and to improve, to help learners improve how they remember and transfer content. Do you see any kind of trends that are coming up in the future?
Right, that's a really interesting question. So from the perspective of any specific theory, I don't think that the field of learning analytics at the moment has a particular theory it builds on, or it was specifically developed. I think the close to that is the work done by Alyssa Wise in 2014, presented at the Learning Analytics and Knowledge Conference. And in that work, she, to a really large extent, built on the existing literature in self-regulated learning, but then try to, in a way, kind of position learning analytics as a dialogue between tasks and designs, learning designs in particular, and analytics that are helping learners to improve their reflection, as well as then consequently, obviously, their better monitoring of their own learning, and consequently to try to evaluate their goals, and then again to improve their planning. So I think from that angle, self-regulated learning is probably one of the closest things. But then when we go dive into the literature a bit, and with a group of doctoral students, we are now working on the analysis of the existing dashboards. There are really, if you wish, the most commonly user-facing representation of learning analytics. What we are finding, there's hardly any ground in the learning analytics. Even in terms of terminology, for example, everybody talks about awareness, and that word even doesn't exist in the literature on self-regulated learning, right? I think in many cases people really what they are referring to is monitoring and metacognition, but they are not in many cases quite acquainted with that literature, which consequently also leads to a number of different omissions, really. They don't focus on what really matters, like, for example, improvement of judgmental learning, or improvement of the overall planning, or improvement of the control of the choices of study tactics learners are taking in their learning. So there are really kind of many of these challenges that are overall. There's another critical challenge there, and that also comes from I would say quite a theoretical perspective in many of these solutions, is that big focus on just visualizing things, as if really visualizations are those that are always necessary to present results of learning analytics. What we are seeing more, and I think that kind of trend will start emerging more and more, is that we will see different types of modalities of feedback. And I think we will also see more connection of learning analytics with the literature on feedback provisioning. And in that sense, also the future work really, where I'm seeing it will be very productive in that sense, is that feedback basically will be able to in real time experiment and always have these constant experiments with feedback. So it'll be in a way design-based research where you'll be also using your classrooms. Yes, you'll be reaching out to the masses that are exposed to different types of feedback. And that feedback can be in textual form, or even some other form that can be in a way also connected with some of the dashboards, but I see a disconnect still.
It's actually interesting because we're talking about this article, Let's Not Forget Learning Analytics Are About Learning. And in that you touched on a number of these issues around feedback. And you talked about this idea that a lot of the feedback based on learning analytics to date has been really process-oriented rather than thinking about how it might apply and get people to do exactly the things you're talking about. Change the way that they evaluate how they're progressing, get them to think metacognitively about what they're doing and what they need to do to get to where they need to be. What does that look like to you? Because it seems like that's a much more complicated problem, because a large part of that is that you're actually asking the student to do a lot of the work to actually make sense of the information that you're giving them and then do something with it in the future. That seems pretty complicated. Have you got a sense of where that's going to go?
No, that's really quite clear what you are suggesting, Jason. And I think, we really need to connect learning analytics with scaffolding literature much better, and to think about the whole process of development of learners. I think as they are being connected with the use of learning analytics, first of all, we cannot possibly underestimate the complexity of the learning tasks that are being engaged into. And yet, if you are also expecting from them to use learning analytics alongside, I think they are doomed to fail, because you're pretty much magnifying the importance of the cognitive load they are being extraneous cognitive load they are being to be exposed. So I think in that process, I see more learning analytics to be probably, at least as you're having learners onboarded, to be much more instrumental in a way that you are giving really clear instruction to learners what they should be focusing on. And to that effect, I'm seeing two types of approaches. One is fairly semi-automated. That's the kind of work that we are working together with Abelardo part at the University of Sydney, and we call that technology on task, where we are seeing teaching staff in the loop, and they are using indicators that are coming from analytics. And then based on these indicators, they are writing, if you wish, something which exists in email systems, but they are called like merge mails. They are creating these templates. And then for the amount of work to support, say, 3 or 4 students, they can create these type of formative feedback opportunities for learners that are scaling up to hundreds or even thousands of learners. And that's really, I think, the first opportunity that we have in the process. The second opportunity that we have in the process is that as we are learning with these types of approaches, we also engage deeper into other approaches that are commonly known as a natural language generation or data to text, where we actually can provide interpretations of some of these findings that are coming from analytics and then articulate them in the form of meaningful feedback back to learners, so that learners really don't have to spend much time about that. Where I'm seeing that the next step in that process is once we have potentially once we have understood some of these opportunities in terms of feedback, articulation, provisioning, we'll go to the next phase where learners really need to be encouraged to reflect whether this feedback is quite true or not. And also we want to encourage that kind of self-regulation of learners and promote their agency. And in that process, then we need to provide that interpretation to them, but then tell them, oh, you know how this interpretation, or you know what was the source of this interpretation, they want to see a bit more. And that's where we can actually engage with learners to start looking into some of these dashboardy type of things, and thus also help them develop their data literacy.
Is there a distinction between analytics for teaching and analytics for learning in that sense? So you've been talking about feedback, I think, mostly in terms of the information that you might be able to feed back to learners themselves so they can better monitor their own learning. You could also feed back information about students' learning to the academics themselves who are putting the course together. So, for example, they might, on the basis of whatever data you have available, make the content that students are engaging with progressively more challenging, depending or easier depending on how difficult they're finding it. So managing their cognitive load in a sense. I think you made some sort of a distinction between academic analytics and learning analytics. Does it follow that kind of distinction between teaching and learning, or is it a different dynamic?
Yeah, I think it's slightly different dynamic. I wanted to particularly emphasize in that paper distinction between academic analytics and learning analytics, because in many cases academic analytics goes into other affairs that are not necessarily related just directly to learning and teaching. You basically start looking into general trends. What is the bottom line in a particular program? And then many things are done at that level. Also issues that are more related, for example, to academic affairs, like, for example, whether analytics can also be used as part of academic annual performance assessment, which is all of a sudden quite actually, I don't know, in some cases even toxic type of a question. So we want to kind of move that conversation, and we don't want to involve there. In terms of learning itself, I mean, it has in its definition two major purposes: to understand and optimize learning. And as such, directly also feeds into teaching, right? And so we don't necessarily see that as a particular distinction, although quite important bit. And also your question in terms of supporting teaching really returns me back to the roots of my research in learning analytics 2005, when I just moved to Canada as a postdoc. We started working on something which you would qualify according to the perspective of teaching analytics, and we developed a tool. At the time, nobody really used the word learning analytics. We developed a tool we called Loco Analyst. Loco in Spanish means madness or crazy. We were thinking this is quite crazy as well, what we were trying to do and to understand learning. But at that stage also we engaged quite heavily with teaching staff in terms of their needs and how we can potentially get better insights for them to improve their learning designs or instructional designs. And in principle, we actually got two critical perspectives that they asked us to focus on. One was to understand, to provide them with insights about conceptual understanding their learners would have. So what kind, and then that basically conceptual understanding to go across the board, for example, not only different types of quizzes, but also discussions, but also even chats and other opportunities, or potentially even other products like essays and so on. And so we try to merge these data sources into some of these visuals that they actually told us how they would like us to present them to. And then they would be even able to understand what concepts learners are talking about, what was their performance with respect to these concepts, and potentially identify some of the issues in that dynamics. The second critical thing that we found with educators was more related to social interactions. They wanted to understand that social dynamics, how students are discussing certain things with who is helping, who is potentially not, and so on, and get some of these insights.
It's interesting, and to sort of pick up on that, I think there's always this sort of worry that when you start bringing algorithms and analytics and things to a teaching situation, that it's going to mean that there will be no future for teachers, that they'll be cut out of the equation, and there'll be no more teaching profession there because the machines will handle everything. I think that's an interesting viewpoint for a couple of reasons, but I think the main one for me is that there is something that teachers can do that is really kind of intuitive in the way that they can respond to students in a real life situation. One of the classic ones, of course, that we deal with is around confusion. So for a teacher to know when students are confused is actually a really fast, easy thing for them to do, because the confusion face that people make is really quite obvious. So that's something that I think that machines are probably still some way away from being able to respond in the same way a teacher could. What's your sense of where all this is going in relation to that? I mean, do you see that the end of the teacher coming, or is it?
I'm quite optimistic about the future of teachers. That's my perspective. I know some colleagues are quite concerned about teachers' agency and kind of the end of teachers. I think we need to really work on and communicate it quite clearly on the understanding of the existing limitations of many algorithms. Algorithms typically build on the past. And we really always talking about learning in the future, and therefore certain things although algorithms are quite good to pick and predict and so on, they are typically picking on the previous context as well. And in many cases, some of these things over time can become quite obsolete. Therefore, I think in many cases, teachers are quite essential to do that. Depends, of course, what we mean by learning as well, and what is the kind of our operational definition of learning and where we want to have that learning applied. I think if we are talking about learning just to get some basic rote learning and promoting some of these fairly straightforward types of lower level of learning outcomes, then I think in those cases that can be potentially automated. But even in those cases where it's automated, we need to really go back and look into the literature on intelligent tutoring systems. They're quite expensive to develop. That's one of the critical things. And so there's scalability. Once you nail, for example, math 101, you can teach math 101. But can you do it in some other disciplines? Or can you actually support the entire university? I think that's really quite critical. The other critical thing is with respect to what we want from our learners. In many cases, there are trends, and also going back again to intelligent tutoring systems, there are really a foundation for what many people are talking today about with respect to adaptive learning. I personally am fine with adaptive learning in some cases, but I really always try to contradict it with something that should be our ultimate goal, and those are adaptive learners. So where the worry pretty much in some of those cases would be that we will be removing decisions from our decision-making opportunities away from our learners. And how can we better learn to make better decisions is by making decisions, right? And always practicing those decisions. And so if you are moving that away, and I think that process, the role of teachers is also quite critical. Because in many cases, while we are saying that some of these feedback opportunities can be automated, in the end of the day, the students are actually in many cases reaching out to their teaching staff as a consequence of some of these of feedback types that were communicated to them to actually get additional advice. And I think in many of cases like that, automated algorithms are really so far from reality to actually can replace teachers in the level of quality that we are talking.
So it's almost as though some of the more nuts and bolts type, crank the handle type tasks and learning activities could potentially be done, with algorithms and various different adaptive technologies helping students to get up to a particular level. And then the teacher adds the kind of value beyond that is the much more complicated, situated, contextualised type knowledge that in higher education we would expect our students to have. That's the sort of thing?
Absolutely. And where I'm seeing at this stage, learning analytics tools that are emerging with respect to practice of teaching is really to empower teachers. To empower teachers, what you have here at the University of Melbourne is this kind of clinical concept of teaching, right? And so in many cases, when you are talking about clinical kind of practice in medicine, you always have lots of results, right? So you do all sorts of analysis and blood work and who knows what, X-ray, etc. And then doctors are trying to make informed decisions based on data. In teaching, really, in most of cases, we have either nothing or our gut feeling. And so with learning analytics, what we are trying to do to inform that practice, but what we are now at the moment missing is potentially in learning analytics is to collect the decisions that teaching staff are making and then potentially then use that to evaluate on a kind of a real-time basis and the effectiveness of some of these best teaching practices so that we potentially can identify what works, what doesn't.
So one of the things that I think about being a complete novice when it comes to learning analytics and from an experimental psychology background is how do you then evaluate some of the insights that you gained through this identification process? So starting with the data and working backwards. Do at any point you go the other way of starting with the insights and seeing whether you can reproduce those insights by, say, inducing if you think that one particular group of students are active learners, inducing an active learning sort of a condition and seeing whether you can reproduce those same analytics. So rather than starting from the data, starting from the insights.
That's a great question. I mean, I think in many cases we start from certain insights. I mean, because in the end of the day, you really want to talk to practitioners.
Yeah.
What are those emerging problems? What are those questions? And that's really the main perspective that we are trying to promote in the field of learning analytics. I personally am not a big proponent of data-driven. I really tend to say data-informed. But then data-informed based on questions. And questions should be driving the whole process. So if the question is basically how can we, for example, improve the engagement of our learners, for example, at the cognitive level or at the social level, then you have already quite practical questions. Then in those cases, first of all, learning analytics can help you to assess the baseline and also to assess the effectiveness of some of your if you wish, interventions that you actually try to implement in practice. Where learning analytics potentially may not deliver up to the rigor that you would as a psychologist expect is, for example, internal validity of some of these things in terms of, like, for example, in psychology, you have very precisely defined protocols, and then you are driving all your participants to a very specific protocol, and then you are doing all sorts of types of things and consequential analysis so that you can actually kind of derive information related to causality. In learning analytics, if you're talking about implementation in practice, then the best we can actually offer is some kind of quasi-experimental condition, and in a way iterative approaches where you actually are following these kind of design-based loops where you are every time you have certain improvements, then you measure them, and then you also get additional insights as well, and then you actually set up certain interventions that you want to test in the future.
Yeah, so in a way, using the data to generate more questions.
Absolutely.
One thing I think is interesting to follow on from that is are you saying that you think that there's not really a lot of use in that kind of fishing in the exhaust approach because they don't have a particular set of questions that they start with? I'm thinking here of other fields like epidemiology and health informatics where that kind of data-driven approach has actually brought in some quite interesting findings that have then led people to go, actually, we should probably look at the relationship between these variables. Do you still see a place for that in that equation, or do you think that it's sort of a mix of all of these things? What's
I see it's a kind of a mix, but at a level of, like, you usually need to start really from some meaningful questions. And then as you are exploring your data will actually lead you to more questions, because you will get insights. You will realize, okay, my question probably didn't make much sense, and I'm going to actually try to better articulate that question. But with respect to these type of questions and approaches, we really need to think in terms of insights that we can get at the level of personalization. Like, for example, here's one thing that we discussed already, generation of personalized emails. So how do I actually measure the effectiveness of that approach?
Yeah.
When actually I have, like, in one of our recent studies in a classroom with about 450 students, on a weekly basis we would generate about 300 unique emails. So how we are actually measuring what's the kind of internal validity in that process? What is the experimental approach?
So measurement is the eternal problem when it comes to these sorts of things. So it's sort of the problem of teaching to the test. You don't know whether that test is really assessing or evaluating what you think it is. So what is the thinking around measurement in learning analytics, and what are the main themes?
Right. I think we are at this stage in terms of measurement really at I would say quite primitive stage. In most of cases, what we are getting is different types of digital traces. Obviously, also different types of grades, different types of social interactions, and so on that can be done, that can be obtained. Plus, also different types of products of learning, such as different types of artifacts that learners are generating. But in terms of actual measurement, you would, the two of you know much better as psychologists. Like, really, when we are developing proper, rigorous testing and assessment, you really need to use psychometrics and go through a very rigorous process of things. How the process at the moment works in most of the learning analytics, general learning environments, is basically you have software engineers who decided, okay, we need to have these digital traces because we are actually tracking whether software worked or didn't, so that we can potentially debug it in the future or in terms of service performance. While that is useful and we can get some insights with that, I think we need to go beyond that and to actually measure what matters, not just because we are having some of these things that are available. Therefore, I think much closer collaboration with people with psychometrics is quite necessary to better instrument, to also look in terms of specific types of learning processes. Like, for example, as I mentioned, like self-regulated learning. So we want to get at that level of kind of micro-level processes. Whether you actually saw traces of planning stage or goal setting stage or enactment or reevaluation of the plan and so on. So you want to get these type of insights so that you potentially then intervene in a much more meaningful way.
Yeah, and another issue I think you mentioned in your paper as well was the issue of generality, that you could in fact design a really decent measure of learning in one particular context and in one domain, but that could look entirely different if you're using different learning analytic tools and in a different classroom with different students and on and on and on. And so at this stage, we're still at that really early stage of not generalizing yet, but you're saying that we definitely need to generalize across domains as well, or What are your thoughts on generalizability?
I think that's one of the really, and even last week when I was at Monash, I talked about validity of learning analytics as one of the three major challenges that I decided to talk about there. And so generalizability obviously comes as the first one. And basically what we experienced so far was an initiative in 2011, which was funded by the Gates Foundation, in which they call it Open Academic Analytics Initiative. And they tried to develop a big predictive model in one institution and reuse that model in several other institutions. And I would say that the initiative really didn't deliver anything because they trained it on the data set that came out of quite rich, small liberal arts institution in New York. And then they tried to actually use it in a kind of a community college type, which served very low socioeconomic population of students. And so, first of all, the accuracy was next to nothing. Also, in terms of the relevant indicators that were predictive, also that was not found that relevant. And I think if you are going at that level as well, if you are trying to have these kind of very generic models, we are actually going to get some of these predictors that are the least common denominators across different, yet they are not informing much practice. So, in terms of generalizability, I think even their theory is really of paramount importance. We need to clearly isolate the constructs that are potentially moderating certain effects or that are mediating certain effects. Theorize these certain things and then start to actually go and operationalize those theoretical concepts potentially differently in different contexts. So you account for the contextual differences, still you actually have a very strong theoretical grounding of all of these different operationalizations.
Absolutely, and I suppose the question of generalizability also depends on what your end goal is. And so if you only really want to use analytics in that specific context, then you probably don't need to see how it generalizes across. But if you are trying to learn something that could be broadly useful, then it's a good step to be taking.
Absolutely. And I mean, we actually, and maybe people got excited about learning analytics with that in mind, really, how we can scale up certain useful practices also in terms of educational psychology, how we can actually scale up also our experimental settings, and also with respect to practice itself, how we can really kind of test whether certain initiatives, like when institutions are implementing different types of flipped classrooms. So how these flipped classrooms can be measured, what are those best practices, what is working, then what is not. But even then, if it is practice, we still cannot really be divorced from theory.
I guess part of that is also that there's so much complexity about what learning actually is. So I think this is an interesting way of thinking about it when you compare it to looking at the kind of medical analogies that we have. The sorts of outcomes, I guess, that they look at, which is something that I've talked about before, is that somebody's sick or they're well, somebody's dead or they're alive. So to an extent, you can sort of start to break down the outcomes. If we're looking at an illness kind of side of it, obviously health's a bit different. Whereas if we think about something like learning, it's not like that. You can't say learned or not learned. So it then becomes a much more sophisticated kind of problem that you're dealing with. I think the other thing that I've always found interesting is that within the learning analytics community, there are so many different ways that people think about what this concept of learning is. You know, is it focused in the mind, or is it focused in society, or is it, where's the central point of analysis that we're kind of dealing with? What's your sense of that?
No, absolutely, Jason, you're right. And I mean, what's learning is not just a kind of theoretical, practical question for educators or learners, but it's also quite ideological as well, quite political as well. And we cannot really underestimate the influences of all of these and with respect to learning. I mean, as long as I would say higher education institutions or generally those that are interested in learning, I think we can build on certain scientific grounds. But even then, even if you are coming from a particular scientific ground and you know that certain things are working or not, and how you can operationalize learning and with respect to what types of skills or capabilities or competencies or whatever terminology you prefer to use, you are trying to measure. The question really is always what you are trying to do with that and how you translate it into practice. And we know that it's quite challenging always. That's one of the critical things. The other thing with respect to these challenges is really to think about not only what you are trying to influence, but also in terms of what is in practice measured. In many cases, we try to apply different types of intervention, and then we are quite surprised that really didn't make a difference on the grades of students. For example, in many cases, people are quite encouraged to initiate different types of debates between students or online discussions and try to promote, for example, development of critical thinking. But then in many cases, then when it comes down to assessment of students, and even inside of those courses where they promoted critical thinking, they don't assess that. And then you have pretty much the disconnect. You are not eventually measuring in terms of the assessment what you are trying to develop among your students. That will be picked easily in learning analytics. I can tell you even from my personal research and practice, right? So we tried to promote these discussions, but we really didn't manage to promote them sufficiently. There was no association with the outcome. Once we managed to actually get the students to the level what we were also measuring inside of these discussions in critical thinking, they are actually getting very clear associations, but also clear prediction as well, who's going to be successful or not. And therefore, we really need to align well our tasks, the types of expected outcomes that these tasks are promoting, and also what we are measuring in the end in terms of the assessment.
Do we think can we use data analytics and learning analytics then to help teachers identify when there's a misalignment? Have they been used in that way?
That's one of my biggest hopes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I don't think it's been used necessarily in that way. I think there are some indicators that are, in a way, or hints, better to say, from the literature, or different researchers are saying, well, this is the way that we could potentially use so that you actually implement certain things, but you see really didn't produce any association with the particular outcome. And so I would say in such situations, we really need to start, and that's really one of the critical things. Analytics is never just data itself or the result itself. Analytics really is different from that in a way that you also need to come up with a process, how you go about data.
Yeah.
And so the critical thing is now when we provide, let's say, you give different small analytical tool, that we also need to provide certain process, how you go about that and say, if you don't find that alignment, then you need to really dive in further and interrogate. And in a way that really then should promote better even scholarship of teaching, right? And scholarship of teaching in principle really means not necessarily rigorous research, but rather that with data here you can actually start yourself interrogating certain things, but also we need to start sharing with others in our departments or academic units and colleagues how they are going about some of these issues.
I think it's interesting that you talk about assessment within that, because I remember going back to the paper that you mentioned this Goodhart's law, which is about us thinking about the proxies as being the be-all and end-all, and not necessarily about the process that led to us getting to that point. Do you think there's a risk in some of this, given that a lot of assessment is still done in not the most effective ways, let's be honest, in higher education? Do you think there's a risk there that we're potentially trying to then get students to be really, really good at doing multiple choice questions and not necessarily doing the kinds of things that we really want them to do? It was interesting to hear you mention decision making as something that we think about from a teacher's perspective. Is that potentially something, for example, that we could focus on from a student perspective, so that it's not just about the production of an exam or whatever else, but it becomes more about what the process is that allows them to get to the point where they have the knowledge that they need to have?
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most critical things that learning analytics needs to promote. I mean, with respect to assessment, obviously there is a threat to really try to make many things quite superficial, and also try to really kind of measure what is easy to measure, not to measure what really matters. And so I think we need to stop thinking about that. First of all, I mean, there are approaches that really you can avoid that. You need to focus on more qualitative types of outcomes, where learners really cannot try to game the system. Like, for example, Ryan Baker, a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, he did a lot of work on gaming the system. Gaming really means trying to get to a certain outcome by really not trying to learn anything, right? And so it's a kind of random series of clicks, eventually trying to get all possible answers and then get to the point. And so in that type of research, they found even then when learners are trying to game the system, it's still much better than trying not to do anything, right? So there are still kind of benefits in that process. But there are some interesting things that in terms of professions, those that have a much higher tendency to game the system, they were doing that at a kind of a longitudinal level as well. They were also much more inclined to go into business schools. I don't want to comment on that further, but there are some interesting things to be actually learned from that. But what I'm trying to say with this is if we don't really go into multiple types of choice questions, but rather if you try to talk about tasks that are quite complex, like, for example, problem solving. With respect to problem solving, you're really guiding learners through kind of a scenario. And even if the answers in some case could be kind of more, even multiple choices, they are really going through a complex problem-solving space. So in that case, you are not really necessarily doing that. But I think there's even much bigger promise by the analysis of textual data that are being generated. Whether we are talking about essays, online discussions, chats by learners, but also problem-solving discourse. And that's been one of the most actually potent sources of understanding of different types of learning processes. Although that is a bit more creepy from the perspective of privacy of learners, but still even an analysis of such data in terms of conversations like we had. So analysis of transcripts that are emerging in that process. More recently as well, even different types of multimodal types of analytics are being used. I don't see them easily used in the foreseeable future in practice, but they can still offer insights, like you mentioned, facial expression. And that's confusion is one of these kind of affective states that is commonly also being tried to mine. And there are some positive results, like people who are like Sidney DeMello and others who are actually getting some interesting findings. But to me, really, I think focus on the qualitative aspects of learning and also trying to assess the process itself as a whole. So there are different types of methods like sequential mining algorithms or process mining or hidden Markov models that can actually give us this kind of insight into learning as a whole rather than as a kind of a simple count of clicks.
Yeah. Picking up on something that you talked about there, because obviously whenever we start to have these conversations and we start to dig down into this level, the privacy and the ethics kinds of issues always come up, and it's always been something that's been sitting in the background of learning analytics research probably since the beginning. Where have we got to with that? What's your sense of where that conversation's got to now, given that we're starting to see some potential for really digging into some low-level things like we've been talking about?
I think we really came a long way in that process. At this stage, there are already several quite tangible documents, codes of practices or recommendations that came from quite robust research that are suggesting what should be doing, how certain things should be done, and so on. So I think that question about privacy ethics, while still quite relevant in a way, like, for example, JISC is an organization in the UK that provides support for the entire higher education sector, and they came up with a code of practice for learning analytics. There was a framework published in 2016, Delicate, that actually suggests also some of these best practices. In Europe, we are also leading a project which is called Sheila, in which we are trying to develop a framework that helps higher education institutions to develop their own institutional policies. In that process, we engage a range of stakeholders, from institutional leaders to experts to students and to teaching staff, where we are seeing, and when we talk to students, both through, even we design an instrument to measure actually students' expectations with respect to their privacy and ethics expectations, but also services. And we also design a similar instrument for teaching staff. We are also seeing different types of ideological differences. Like, for example, first of all, learners have high expectations from institutions to use their data, and they are quite surprised why data are not used. Of course, they expect privacy to be protected, etc., but really they don't see that as a problem. They are quite aware that they gave informed consent to institutions. Where they have concerns is if the institution is going to sell their data to third parties or use third parties to analyze their data, then they would expect certain types of additional provisioning to be actually an additional type of informed consent, which is fair enough. However, there are also ideological differences, like between teaching staff and students. Whether staff have obligation to act when data are suggesting so. Students actually think that's one of the strongest expectations of students, what we are finding in our empirical studies so far, where teaching staff think that's not their responsibility.
Wow, so there's like a duty of care thing.
Exactly.
There. Wow.
Exactly. So we are seeing that. And there are other types of things, like, for example, we ask students to actually give us judgments or expectations in ideal case versus what they expect would happen in reality. And they are actually always quite clear that they expect in reality that the institutions will under-deliver compared to their ideal expectations, right? It's quite significant.
Yeah.
Exactly, quite telling, right? One of these things is also, for example, where we found the biggest difference was that teaching staff will be trained to use learning analytics effectively, which is quite an interesting indicator. On the other end of the spectrum, when we talk teaching staff, they actually, first of all, have much bigger privacy expectations for their students. They love to be advocates of their students, although they are not really quite aligned with the expectations of students. The second thing is, when we ask them a bit more qualitatively, teaching staff, they start really talking just about workload, and just concerned that analytics will increase their workload. So they don't really so much talk about other types of things, but in many cases they talk about workload because they haven't really tried learning analytics at all in practice.
even though there is a potential in what these sorts of tools that are becoming available that will actually cut down the amount of work that
Absolutely.
they need to do. So I guess sort of starting to wrap up what we've been talking about, what are you most excited about in terms of where we're going in the next few years? Is there anything that really stands out to you that you think, this is going to be really neat, this is going to make some really big changes and people are going to be really surprised about what's coming out?
My most strong perspective is that we will be seeing more and more benefits that are coming from the generation of feedback in practice. And I think that type of insight will actually offer us lots of opportunities. Not only is it going to offer us opportunities in terms of improvement of students' experience, potentially even happiness with feedback, but more importantly, the learning outcomes and learning processes. But I think also will help us as the field to actually dive deeper in terms of understanding of underlying learning processes. And I think, in a nutshell, that will probably be one of the most exciting areas and pieces of work to do.
All right. Picking up on that, so you talked a little bit more about the feedback processes and making things more conscious for the students. Is there another side to this which is more sort of within that idea of persuasive technology and nudge analytics and those sorts of things where it's a lot more subtle but goes back again to this idea of helping students to make decisions in better ways? What's your sense of what's happening in that space? Do you think there's a lot going on there? And
there's hardly anything really significant happening in that space. Maybe there are a few, but I wouldn't really be able to name those that are doing that type of research. I think that's spot on. And I think that'll be quite promising to try to have some of these different types of nudges. But when you're actually talking about nudges, I think there's slight potentially, which is actually quite exciting as a great opportunity, but also slight tension there with respect to when we talk about nudges to actually nail them down with respect to how we actually are more intentional about them. That's one thing. The second thing is also how we are actually grounding them in something which is kind of theoretically as well sound. And I think that's really with nudges. Nudges are quite practical. They can actually go, but then their explanation why they worked or not is becoming quite challenging, which is really great type of a topic to work on.
Yeah, it's really interesting because having come from a sort of behavioural economics perspective where all of this nudge sort of work originated, I guess it's one of those things where there's a kind of dichotomous outcome to a lot of what they were aiming to do there as well. Buy product or don't buy product kind of idea. Yeah. So to try and implement it in the kind of environment that we're talking about becomes a much more complicated kind of issue. But I guess one side of it is that it would kind of be nice to see it used for good instead of evil.
No, I completely agree. I mean, and some of that behavioral economics is really something that I am quite excited myself. And there are certain studies that were done also in research and education, self-regulated learning, trying to improve judgments of learning. But it's quite actually becoming relevant for learning analytics as well. Like there was a recent project at Stanford University. They wanted to implement institution-wide dashboards for students where they publish historic data about grades and everything, and then averages and students that can actually compare and potentially set the goals. It's unpublished, so I don't know specific details, but I know some basically anecdotal types of things that were actually told to me. And they are saying that actually that whole technology played a negative effect on learners. Why? And if you go back to some of your things that you mentioned from behavioral economics, like the anchoring effect, we first of all know that we are generally quite overconfident in our judgments of learning. And there were studies that were manipulated a type of normative feedback by saying what was the average performance. And so when they actually provided the real performance, which was relatively higher, people were actually quite overconfident and thus under-deliver in that task. When they provided fictitious feedback, that the task was much harder. So the average grade was much lower than actually was in reality. And so I think there are potentially ethical questions, but my thing is and this is quite a concrete example, although you may say, well, you are actually deceiving your learners actually for their good. So I think there are such ethical dilemmas that we actually need to resolve if we want to scale up some of these things in practice when we talk about learning.
That seems to me like a really good opportunity to use these ideas about nudging students towards better learning to help shape visualizations and things like that, which at the moment are really lacking in any sort of evidence. And so that could be a potential opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think if we are talking about research, but also practice, but we need to really, I mean, when I'm now talking to people who do learning analytics research, really need to ground that much stronger in that kind of literature that is coming from behavioral economics or cognitive psychology or whatever. But if you are just trying to kind of follow your gut, in many cases you are missing many opportunities.
Yeah, because I think the interesting other aspect of that is when we start to look at how people learn in online environments, the multimedia aspects of that in some of the research that we've been looking at tend to promote in people this idea that they do actually understand the material better than they actually understand it. You know, there's that kind of Wikipedia effect where people will read a couple of Wikipedia articles and all of a sudden think that they're an expert on something. So I guess the flip side is that we're creating these environments that make people feel really confident that they understand something and then letting them run with it, despite the fact that they're getting this false impression. So there's something, I think, interesting in that space in how analytics might actually help to get students to think a little bit more critically about whether or not that information that seems to be going down really well and makes a lot of sense to them is actually the way that it really is, and whether they're over-interpreting how much they actually understand about it.
Absolutely. I think, no, you are right, Jason, there. I mean, many people actually are victims of this kind of fluency bias, right? Looks very fluent, but it's actually still needs to be learned, right? And so in many cases we cannot possibly underestimate. I think learning analytics potentially can help us to identify certain patterns, how those that are effective with respect to learning, they're interacting with certain resources. There were some studies done by Pierre Dillenburg at EPFL in Lausanne, and they identify some of these patterns with respect to, for example, if learners are really just going seamlessly through videos, and those who don't, but rather they do lots of rewinding, etc. It was actually quite significantly associated with cognitive load, and also when they were actually doing it for the first time. So even in many cases, what we are finding, we recently even did a study which tried to engage students' information seeking skills. And in that case, even self-reported a measure of background knowledge was quite predictive actually of their actual knowledge and also the time they spend on tasks. So just even potentially asking learners to self-report some of these things in some cases, and in a way that's, I don't know whether it is, we are both psychologists, whether you will agree or not, but probably it's also kind of a proxy as well of a goal, if you wish, or a motivation as well, that kind of self-reported, and then potentially then aligning some learning analytics later on that can actually be provided, and then also identifying some of the video, for example, points where you can try to actually engage learners into interaction, for example, to ask a question, etc., and to actually describe certain things. Because in the end of the day, if they are actually just at that surface level of learning, just watching or reading, they are hardly really exercising their memory retrieval.
That's interesting, because it shows that it might not actually be bad that there's a mismatch between people's confidence and their actual learning, because you can then, so provided that you give them feedback, because then that's going to create some sort of surprise and even better learning down the track. So it might not necessarily be a bad thing so long as we're providing feedback, even if they're confidently wrong in their knowledge of the content. That's fixable. What's less fixable is if they're not engaging and not confident either way, or they're not engaging in the content either way.
No, that's really important and significant thing. We also found that learning analytics can be quite detrimental in some cases, especially for learners with lower level of self-efficacy, which is also quite associated with lower level of background knowledge and also negative experiences they had in the past. So I think we need to really, analytics, we can do whatever we want with data, but we really need to go, in that case, if you want to try to fix self-efficacy, you need to really look at what are the practices to fix motivation, how to motivate people. Analytics will not provide us all the solution there, but really what we know about motivating people and also growing their confidence.
So I think that's been a fantastic conversation, and we picked up on a number of different things. It's certainly going to make me go away and read some more stuff about some of this. So thanks, Dragan. It's been a pleasure having you on, and hopefully we'll get to chat again at some point.
Thanks, Rachel.
Yeah,
thanks, Jason.
Thank
pleasure to be here at Melbourne.